They called him the Iron Duke, a man forged from tragedy and duty, his heart as cold and vast as his sprawling northern estate. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was a titan of industry and politics, a man whose calculated decisions could make or break fortunes. But every night, a ghost drifted through the stone corridors of Shadowfen Manor. It wasn't a spirit of the dead, but of the living. It was the sound of a piano, played with a soul-shattering grief by the one man who had sworn off music forever. He played in secret for the ghosts of his past, never knowing that in the shadows a woman he barely acknowledged was listening, and that every note was slowly teaching her the language of his broken heart. The November wind was a bitter beast, clawing at the carriage windows as it rattled its way deeper into the heart of Northumberland. For Eleanor Vance, the desolate beauty of the moors was a fitting backdrop for her own quiet life. She was neither debutante nor damsel, but something far more invisible. A companion. At 24, with a modest dowry and even more modest connections, her position as companion to the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood was a respectable, if unexciting, fate. The carriage finally crunched to a halt before the imposing facade of Shadowfen Manor. It was a Gothic masterpiece of grey stone and stern, mullioned windows that seemed to stare out at the world with a permanent scowl. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress built to keep joy out. Her charge, Lady Beatrice Beaumont, a woman whose wit was as sharp as her features were soft, poked Eleanor gently with a gloved finger. "Don't let the old girl intimidate you, my dear. She's much like my nephew, all grim stone on the outside, but, well, the inside is mostly grim stone too. You just have to find the one room with a decent fireplace." Eleanor offered a weak smile. The nephew in question was the formidable Alistair Beaumont, the current Duke of Blackwood. She had seen him once in London, a tall, severe figure whose dark hair and piercing grey eyes seemed to absorb all the light around him. He had inherited the title 5 years prior, after a family tragedy that society still whispered about. They said it had broken him, or rather, had fired the final, hardening kiln of his already austere personality. Life at Shadowfen quickly fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Days were spent reading to Lady Beatrice, walking in the windswept gardens, and taking tea in a drawing room where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. The Duke was a fleeting figure, seen only at dinner. He presided over the meal with a detached courtesy, his conversation clipped and confined to matters of estate or politics. He never looked at Eleanor for longer than a moment, his gaze sliding past her as if she were another piece of furniture. She was, she understood, an employee, a ghost at the feast. It was on her third night that she heard it. A storm was raging outside, and Eleanor lay awake, listening to the rain lash against the thick glass of her window. And then, beneath the percussion of the storm, another sound emerged. It was faint at first, a thread of melody woven through the howl of the wind. It was a piano. The playing was not the polished, technical perfection one heard in London ballrooms. This was something raw, deeply personal. It was a torrent of sorrow, a nocturne that wept and raged, its notes falling like black pearls into the cavernous silence of the house. The music was filled with such a profound despair that Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. Who in this house of stone and silence possessed such a passion? The next night, it came again. And the night after. Always after midnight, always from a distant part of the manor. Eleanor began to anticipate it, lying in bed with her book untouched, waiting for the first, hesitant notes to drift up from below. The music became her secret. It spoke of a grief she couldn't name, a love that had been shattered, a guilt that gnawed at the player's very soul. It was the only sign of genuine, untamed emotion she had encountered in the entire estate. One evening, driven by a curiosity that bordered on obsession, she slipped out of her room. Pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, she followed the sound. It led her away from the main living quarters, down a cold, disused corridor in the west wing. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the grimy windows. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of old paper and decay. The music grew stronger here, clearer. It poured from behind a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. The door was closed but not fully latched. A thin sliver of warm, flickering light escaped from the crack. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Eleanor crept closer. She peered through the narrow opening, her breath catching in her chest. The room was a forgotten music salon, draped in dusty white sheets. In the center of the room, seated at a magnificent grand piano, was Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled up, and his usually immaculate cravat was loosened. His head was bowed, his dark hair falling over his brow as his fingers moved over the keys. His face, illuminated by a single candelabra, was a mask of torment. This was not the cold, unfeeling Iron Duke. This was a man laid bare, his soul bleeding out through his fingertips. He was playing Chopin, a piece so saturated with pain it was almost unbearable to hear. Eleanor felt as though she were intruding on the most private of confessions, a prayer offered up to a silent God. She saw a tear trace a path down his stern cheek, and she instinctively took a step back, a floorboard groaning under her foot. The music stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. "Who's there?" His voice was a low growl, sharp and dangerous. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She flattened herself against the wall, her heart seizing with terror. She had been discovered. She had trespassed not just on his property, but on his very soul. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Eleanor held her breath, convinced the frantic beating of her own heart would give her away. She could hear the faint hiss of the candles from within the room, the distant howl of the wind. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to flee, but she was frozen, pinned by the Duke's sharp, interrogating command. After what felt like an eternity, she heard a heavy sigh from within, followed by the soft thud of the piano's fallboard being closed. The light under the door was extinguished. She heard the scrape of a chair, the tread of heavy footsteps moving away from the door, deeper into the room. He hadn't come to investigate. Perhaps he had dismissed the sound as the groaning of the old house. Letting out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, Eleanor retreated as silently as a wraith, her slippers making no sound on the dusty floorboards. She didn't stop until she was safely back in her own room, the door bolted behind her. Her hands were trembling. She had seen the Iron Duke's secret. She had seen the raw, bleeding wound he kept so carefully hidden from the world. The man who disdained all forms of art and leisure, who spoke only of ledgers and land yields, played the piano with the passion of a tormented virtuoso. The discovery changed everything. The next day at dinner, she could not look at him without seeing the man at the piano. The cold mask of aristocratic duty seemed thinner now. A fragile facade she could see right through. His clipped, formal words were no longer signs of arrogance, but of a carefully constructed defense. When he spoke, she listened for the echoes of the music she'd heard, the undertones of sorrow, the carefully suppressed anger. He, for his part, seemed entirely unaware of her inner turmoil. He was, if anything, even more distant than usual. His brow was furrowed, his replies to his aunt's cheerful chatter almost monosyllabic. He looked exhausted, the skin under his grey eyes smudged with shadow. He had not played the following night, nor the night after that. Eleanor found herself missing the ghostly melody, her nights feeling empty and silent. She worried that her near discovery had frightened him into stopping, that she had inadvertently taken away his only solace. Her opportunity to understand more came unexpectedly. Lady Beatrice had requested a volume of poetry from the main library, a vast 2-story chamber that smelled richly of leather and beeswax. As Eleanor searched the shelves, she overheard the Duke speaking with his estate manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, near the large stone fireplace. "The tenants in the north quadrant are petitioning for another month's grace on the rent, Your Grace," Henderson said, his tone deferential. "The late frost has crippled the barley harvest." Eleanor expected a cold, calculated refusal. The Iron Duke was known for his ruthless efficiency. "Look at their records from the last 5 years," Alistair replied, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Any family that has been consistently timely, grant them the month. For the others, forgive half of what is owed for this quarter. We will absorb the loss. It is better to have a loyal, solvent tenant next year than a bankrupt one now." Henderson blinked, surprised. "Your Grace, that is most generous." "It is practical, Henderson, nothing more," the Duke stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room, and for a heart-stopping second, his eyes met Eleanor's. There was no recognition, just a flicker of surprise at finding her there. He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod and strode from the room. Eleanor stood frozen, a book of Keats in her hand. Generosity disguised as practicality, compassion hidden beneath a veneer of cold logic. It was just like his music, a beautiful, aching soul trapped inside a fortress of ice. That night, she was drawn back to the West Wing. She couldn't help it. She told herself it was wrong, an unforgivable invasion of his privacy. But the pull was irresistible. She crept down the cold corridor and found her listening post outside the music room door. For a long while, there was only silence. Disappointed, she was about to turn back when she heard it, not the piano, but the faint squeak of a cork being pulled from a bottle, followed by the glug of liquid. Then a single, discordant chord crashed through the silence, angry and unresolved. It was followed by another, then a cascade of furious, broken arpeggios. This was not the lyrical sorrow of before. This was pure, unadulterated rage. It was the sound of a man at war with himself. The music was chaotic, stumbling over itself, as if the player's hands could not keep up with the tempest in his mind. Eleanor sank to the floor, leaning her back against the cold wall, and closed her eyes. She didn't need to see him to know how he looked. She could picture him perfectly, his jaw clenched, his shoulders rigid, pouring all his frustration and pain into the uncomplaining keys. She listened for an hour as the fury slowly subsided, melting back into the familiar, heartbreaking melancholy. He was grieving. But for what? Or for whom? The answer came from Lady Beatrice a week later. They were arranging flowers in the morning room when the Dowager Duchess sighed, looking out at the bleak landscape. "This house used to be filled with music," she said, her voice wistful. "My younger nephew, Julian. He was the light of this family. Alistair worshipped him." Eleanor held her breath, carefully snipping the stem of a white rose. "Julian was a prodigy," Lady Beatrice continued, her eyes distant. "He could make a piano sing. He was meant for the concert halls of Vienna and Paris. Alistair, even as a boy, was always the serious one, the heir. He was so proud of his brother's talent. He would just sit and listen for hours." She paused, her expression clouding over. Then came the accident. A boating trip on the lake. The weather turned. Julian was never a strong swimmer. Alistair tried to save him. He dived in again and again, into the freezing water, until his men had to physically pull him out, half dead himself. They found Julian's body 2 days later. A chill that had nothing to do with the November air washed over Eleanor. Alistair has never forgiven himself, Lady Beatrice finished, her voice barely a whisper. He was 19. He locked up the music room the day after the funeral, and hasn't allowed a note of music to be played in this house since. He sees it as a frivolous indulgence, a painful reminder of what he lost, or rather, what he believes he failed to protect. Suddenly, every sorrowful nocturne, every furious chord Eleanor had heard, made perfect, devastating sense. Alistair wasn't just playing the piano, he was talking to his brother. He was reliving his failure, punishing himself, and keeping Julian's spirit alive in the only way he knew how, shrouded in secrecy and shame. The ghost in the manor wasn't Julian, it was the Duke himself. The knowledge of the Duke's past settled upon Eleanor like a shroud. It recontextualized every stern glance, every clipped command, every moment of cold detachment. He wasn't cruel, he was in mourning. He wasn't unfeeling, he was drowning in a sea of guilt so deep he had built a fortress around himself to keep from being consumed by it. Her clandestine vigils outside the music room took on a new solemnity. She was no longer just a curious listener. She was a keeper of his secret, a silent witness to his grief. She learned the shape of his sorrow through the pieces he played. Brahms for the nights of deep, introspective melancholy, Beethoven when his anger and frustration boiled over, and always, always Chopin, for the tender, heart-breaking memories of his lost brother. An unexpected opportunity for interaction arose a few days later. A heavy, early snow had blanketed the grounds, trapping everyone indoors. The library, with its roaring fire, became the main gathering place. Lady Beatrice was napping in her chair, and Eleanor was engrossed in a novel when the Duke entered, a stack of ledgers under his arm. He settled at the large mahogany desk, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. Eleanor tried to focus on her book, but her awareness of him was a palpable thing. She could feel his presence across the room, a tightly coiled spring of energy and control. She chanced a glance at him. His brow was knitted in concentration, but a deep weariness was etched around his eyes. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. On impulse, she put down her book, rose, and quietly approached the tea service that had been left on a side table. She poured a cup, adding a splash of milk and a spoonful of sugar, just as she'd seen his valet do. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. What was she doing? He would surely rebuke her for the familiarity. Taking a steadying breath, she walked over to his desk. "Your Grace," she said softly. Alistair looked up, his grey eyes sharp with surprise, a hint of irritation in them. "Miss Vance? I thought you might care for some tea," she said, placing the cup and saucer on the edge of his desk, careful not to disturb his papers. The fire can be quite drying. He stared at the cup, then at her. She expected a curt dismissal. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He seemed momentarily lost for words. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice gruff but lacking its usual icy edge. She gave a small curtsy and retreated back to her chair, her cheeks burning. She had breached the unspoken barrier between them. She picked up her book, but the words swam before her eyes. A few minutes later, she heard the soft clink of porcelain as he drank the tea. The simple sound felt like a momentous victory. The true shift came that evening. He was at the piano again, but tonight the music was different. It was hesitant, searching. He was playing a melody she didn't recognize, a simple, questioning theme that he repeated over and over, altering it slightly each time. It felt less like a performance of grief and more like an act of creation. It was fragile, yet threaded with a nascent hope. Lost in the music, Eleanor leaned her head back against the corridor wall, her eyes closed. It's about the promise of spring after a long winter, isn't it? The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, spoken in a near whisper, not to him, but to the music itself. The playing stopped instantly. This time there was no mistaking it. He had heard her. The silence was absolute, charged with shock and discovery. Eleanor's eyes flew open, her blood turning to ice. She had done it now. She had spoken. She scrambled to her feet, ready to run, but the heavy oak door creaked open. Alistair stood in the doorway, a single candle in his hand. The light cast long, dancing shadows, throwing his face into sharp relief. He looked not at the end of the hall where she stood, but directly at the spot on the floor where she had been sitting. His expression was not one of rage, as she had feared, but of stunned, profound disbelief. He slowly raised his eyes and met hers. The Iron Duke's mask was gone. In its place was a raw vulnerability she had only ever glimpsed in the candlelight of the music room. He looked at her, the silent listener, the woman who had somehow found her way into the most secret, guarded chamber of his heart. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, holding the candle, and in his gaze she saw not an accusation, but a question, a desperate, unspoken question that the music had been asking all along. Do you understand? Eleanor couldn't speak. She could only stand her ground, her heart aching with a sudden, overwhelming wave of compassion. She answered his silent question with her eyes, giving a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, I understand. He held her gaze for another long moment, before giving a stiff nod of his own. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the room and gently closed the door, leaving her alone in the darkness of the corridor. He did not lock it. The unlocked door was an invitation, a silent treaty. Eleanor did not dare enter the room, but her presence in the hallway was no longer a transgression. It was an accepted, unspoken part of his nightly ritual. She would bring a cushion from her room and sit outside the door, and he would play. A strange, intimate connection flourished in that dark, cold corridor, a relationship built not on words, but on shared sorrow and the language of music. The change in their daytime interactions was subtle, but profound. The Duke no longer looked past her. His grey eyes would seek hers across the dinner table, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. He began to include her in conversations, asking her opinion on a book she was reading, or a current event. He spoke to her not as an employer to an employee, but as an equal. Lady Beatrice watched these developments with a shrewd, knowing glint in her eye, but thankfully said nothing. This fragile truce was shattered by the arrival of Lord Harrington. George Harrington was a neighbouring landowner, a man whose polished charm and handsome face failed to conceal a predatory watchfulness in his eyes. He arrived at Shadowfen to discuss a land boundary dispute, but his interest quickly settled on Eleanor. He was overtly flirtatious, his compliments cloying and unwelcome. "A rose blooming in the northern frost," he murmured to her one afternoon in the drawing-room, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What is a woman like you doing, hidden away in this mausoleum?" Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. "I find it very peaceful, my lord." "Peace is another word for boredom," he countered with a slick smile. "You belong in London, Miss Vance, in the light." The Duke, who had been examining a map on a nearby table, looked up. His expression was thunderous. "Lord Harrington," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the room. "Miss Vance is a guest in this house, my aunt's companion. I expect her to be treated with the respect due to her position." Harrington's smile tightened, a flash of resentment in his eyes. "Of course, Blackwood. No offense intended. Simply making pleasant conversation." The tension was so thick, it was almost suffocating. From that moment on, Alistair was a constant, protective presence whenever Harrington was near Eleanor. He would steer conversations away from her or position himself physically between them, a silent, intimidating guardian. Eleanor had never felt so defended, so seen. The boundary dispute dragged on, keeping Harrington a frequent, unwelcome visitor at Shadowfen. His animosity towards the Duke was palpable, a bitter rivalry that seemed to extend beyond mere property lines. Eleanor learned from Lady Beatrice that Harrington's family had been losing money for years, while Blackwood's fortunes, under Alistair's shrewd management, had soared. Harrington was a man desperate to reclaim his status, and he viewed Alistair with a potent mixture of envy and hatred. One evening, Harrington overstayed his welcome, joining them for dinner. The meal was a strained affair. Harrington directed several pointed questions at Alistair about his aversion to social events in London. "One never sees you at the opera, Blackwood," Harrington said, swirling the wine in his glass, or any concerts for that matter. "Do you have no appreciation for the finer arts?" Alistair's jaw tightened. "I have little time for such distractions." "A pity," Harrington mused, his eyes glittering with malice. "They say music soothes the savage breast. Perhaps a man in your position needs a bit of soothing. All that focus on industry and profit must be terribly draining. Makes a man hard. Brittle even." Eleanor saw the flash of pain in Alistair's eyes before he masked it. He was thinking of Julian. The casual cruelty of Harrington's words was like a knife twisting in an open wound. Later that night, the music that came from the West Wing was the most tormented she had ever heard. It was a violent, clashing storm of notes, full of pain and unresolved fury. Eleanor sat outside the door, her own heart aching in sympathy, wishing she could do something, anything, to ease his suffering. The music stopped abruptly. She heard a muffled crash, as if something had been thrown against a wall. Worried, she rose to her feet just as the door was flung open. Alistair stood there, his face pale, his breathing ragged. He looked utterly undone. In his hand, he clutched a shattered silver frame. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," Alistair said, his voice raw. He wasn't speaking to her, but to the ghosts in the room. He looked down at the broken frame in his hand, and for the first time she saw the portrait it had held, a miniature of a smiling young man with dark hair and bright, laughing eyes. Julian. "It wasn't a distraction," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It was everything." He looked up at Eleanor then, his defenses completely gone. He saw not a servant, but a confidant, the only person in the world who knew the truth. "He blames me," Alistair said, the confession torn from him. "Harrington. He was there that day, on the shore. He said I was reckless. He said I challenged Julian to swim in the storm." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's not true." "It doesn't matter," Alistair said, his voice hollow. "It's what I have told myself every day for 5 years." Without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward, closing the space between them. She reached out and gently took the broken frame from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was cold as ice. "The music tells a different story," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't speak of recklessness. It speaks of love. and of a loss so great it has tried to silence your own heart. But it can't. I can still hear it, beating in every note you play." Alistair stared at her, his grey eyes searching hers. The storm in them began to quiet, replaced by a dawning wonder. He had been playing his grief into a void for 5 long years, and for the first time, someone had not only listened, but had understood. He slowly raised his hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and life in the cold, silent manner. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was the first time he had ever used her given name. In that single word, a wall crumbled, and the Duke and the companion were gone. There were only Alistair and Eleanor, 2 lonely souls connected by a secret melody in the heart of the shadows. That night marked a profound change. The corridor was no longer a barrier between them. The next evening, Eleanor found the music room door left slightly ajar. It was a clear, deliberate invitation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was just as she had first seen it, a time capsule of forgotten joy, filled with sheet-draped furniture that looked like sleeping ghosts. But tonight, a second candelabra had been lit, casting a warmer, more welcoming glow. Alistair was not at the piano. He stood by the tall, arched window, looking out at the moonlit snow. He turned as she entered. "I thought you might be more comfortable in here," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you," she whispered, her hands clasped before her. She didn't know where to sit, what to do. The unspoken rules of their secret world were being rewritten. He seemed to understand her uncertainty. He gestured towards a small, velvet settee that he had cleared of its dust sheet. "Please." She sat, feeling impossibly formal in this deeply personal space. He watched her for a moment before moving to the piano. He sat down, not to play, but to simply rest his hands on the keys. "No one has been in this room since my mother died, except for me," he said, staring at his hands. Julian filled it with so much life. After he was gone, the silence was deafening. I thought if I locked it away, I could lock the memories away too. But memories don't work like that, Eleanor finished for him, her voice gentle. He looked at her, a sad smile touching his lips. "No, they don't." He turned back to the piano and began to play. It was different with her in the room. The music felt less like a solitary confession and more like a conversation. He would play a passage, and his eyes would flick to her, as if asking for her thoughts. She would respond with a nod, a smile, a small involuntary gasp at a particularly beautiful turn of phrase. He played the piece he had been composing, the one about the promise of spring. It was more complete now, its themes of hope and renewal stronger, more confident. He played it not for his brother, but for her. It was a gift, an offering. When the final, gentle chord faded into the silence, the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with genuine awe. "It's full of hope." "I hadn't felt much of that for a long time," he admitted, his gaze intense. "Not until I realized someone was listening." Their evenings in the music room became their sanctuary. Sometimes they would talk for hours before he played, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their quiet disappointments. She learned of the immense pressure he had been under since birth, the lonely burden of the dukedom. He learned of her love for literature, her quiet life in the countryside, her longing for a life that was more than just a footnote in someone else's story. He discovered her keen ear for music. She could identify the subtlest shifts in emotion in his playing, the nuances that even he was sometimes unaware of. "You play that passage with more anger than you did last week," she observed one night after he finished a powerful Beethoven sonata. He stopped, surprised. The negotiations for the railway contract have stalled. Harrington is on the board. He's blocking every move I make. He flexed his fingers. I suppose my frustration found its way out. Let it, she encouraged. It's better than letting it fester inside. He looked at her with a gratitude so profound it made her heart ache. She was not just healing him. She was giving him permission to feel, to be human. The emotional intimacy between them began to spill over into their days. A shared glance over the breakfast table, a walk together in the thawing gardens where he pointed out the first snowdrops, an evening spent reading by the library fire, sitting closer than propriety would normally allow. Lady Beatrice looked on with an expression of supreme satisfaction. The physical tension between them was a constant, humming presence, the brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a book, the way his gaze would linger on her lips when she spoke. The air in the music room, in particular, crackled with an unspoken desire. One night, after he had played a nocturne of breathtaking tenderness, he rose from the piano and came to sit on the settee beside her. The space between them was infinitesimal. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint scent of sandalwood and old books that clung to him. Eleanor, he said, his voice a low murmur, what you have done for me, you have come into this house of silence and filled it with life again. You didn't just listen to my music, you listened to me. He raised his hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. Her breath hitched. His grey eyes, no longer stormy or cold, were dark with an emotion that was deep, powerful, and entirely new to her. I find myself, he continued, his voice growing thick, thinking not of the past when I play any more. I find myself thinking only of you. He leaned in, his intention clear. This was the moment the music had been leading to, the crescendo of their unspoken duet. Eleanor's eyes fluttered shut as his lips met hers. The kiss was not hesitant or questioning. It was a release of years of pent-up sorrow, loneliness, and a desperate, yearning love. It was the desperate passion of his Beethoven and the tender romance of his Chopin all at once. In his kiss, she felt the last of the ice around his heart, finally, irrevocably, melt away. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the understanding and affection she had been storing in her heart. In the forgotten music room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Alistair and Eleanor found a new song, a melody that belonged only to them. But they were not the only ones in the house with secrets. A pair of eyes had been watching. A resentful, calculating mind had been piecing together the whispers, the changed routines, the unlocked door to the West Wing. Lord Harrington, staying late one evening under the pretense of reviewing final documents, had followed the faint strains of music. He had seen the light under the door. He had seen Eleanor slip into the room. He now held the Duke's most vulnerable secret in his hand, and he knew exactly how to use it to destroy him. The idyllic interlude at Shadowfen was destined to be fleeting. A summons arrived from London. The final vote on the Northumbrian Railway expansion, a project Alistair had poured years of effort and a significant portion of his fortune into, was imminent. His presence was required. Lord Harrington, a key member of the Oversight Committee, would also be there. He means to ruin me, Alistair told Eleanor the night before he was due to depart. They were in the music room, but the atmosphere was heavy with impending dread. He hadn't touched the piano. He's been spreading rumors for weeks, that my judgment is clouded, that I've become reclusive and unstable. This railway is my vision for the future of the North. If I lose this vote, hundreds of families will lose their livelihood." "You won't lose," Eleanor said, with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "Your plans are sound. Your logic is impeccable. They will see that." He took her hands, his grip tight. "Stay here, Eleanor. Stay at Shadowfen where you're safe. London is a viper's nest." "You will need a friend," she insisted softly. "My place is with your aunt, and your aunt's place is by your side." She could not bear the thought of him facing this alone. And so, the Blackwood household, including Eleanor and Lady Beatrice, decamped to the Duke's London residence, a stern, palatial house on Belgrave Square. The city was a jarring contrast to the quiet solitude of Shadowfen. It was loud, chaotic, and filled with prying eyes. Harrington, it turned out, had been far more insidious than they imagined. The rumours he'd spread were not just about Alistair's business acumen. They were personal and vicious. He hinted at a deep-seated melancholy, a mental frailty inherited from his mother, who had suffered from nervous ailments. He painted Alistair's reclusiveness not as grief, but as a worrying sign of instability. The Iron Duke's reputation for unshakable control, the very foundation of his power, was being systematically eroded. The climax was to be a grand soirée hosted by Lord Ashworth, the influential chairman of the Railway Committee. It was the night before the final vote. Everyone who mattered in finance and politics would be there. It was here, Alistair knew, that Harrington would make his final, public play to discredit him. Eleanor, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue silk, felt hopelessly out of place amongst the glittering diamonds and sharp whispers of the London elite. She watched Alistair from across the ballroom. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, a commanding presence. But she could see the strain around his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. Harrington was holding court near the string quartet, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He intercepted Eleanor as she tried to make her way to Alistair's side. "Miss Vance?" he purred, his eyes cold and reptilian. "You've scrubbed up remarkably well. From country mouse to city companion. Quite the transformation." "Excuse me, my lord," Eleanor said, trying to step past him. He blocked her way, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know, you see. I know all about the West Wing. The midnight music, the little tete-a-tetes." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Harrington sneered. A man of Blackwood standing, with his family history of fragility, locking himself away to play mournful dirges all night. It hardly inspires confidence, does it? The board members might think he's lost his mind. They might think he is being preyed upon by an ambitious little nobody, whispering poison in his ear. The threat was clear. He would not just expose Alistair's secret, he would twist it, using her as the weapon. He would paint their pure, healing connection as a sordid affair, proof of the Duke's instability and her manipulative nature. "You are a vile man," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "I'm a practical one," he retorted. "Blackwood is finished, but you could still do well for yourself. A smart girl knows when to abandon a sinking ship." He left her then, striding purposefully towards Lord Ashworth, a look of grim determination on his face. Eleanor watched in horror. He was going to do it now. He was going to destroy the man she loved in front of everyone. Her first instinct was to run to Alistair, to warn him. But what could he do? A denial would look like a cover-up. An admission would be seen as a confession of weakness. Harrington had crafted the perfect trap. She looked at Alistair, who now stood talking to a group of investors, his face a stoic mask. She saw the years of pain he had carried, the fragile hope she had helped him rediscover, the future he was fighting so hard to build, and a fierce, protective fire ignited within her. She was not the same timid companion who had arrived at Shadowfen months ago. She was no longer a ghost. Alistair's love and his music had given her a voice, and she would be damned if she let a man like Harrington silence them. Just as Harrington cleared his throat to address Lord Ashworth and the surrounding group, Eleanor began to walk. Not away, not towards Alistair, but towards the grand piano that sat silent and ornamental at the far end of the ballroom. Every eye turned to watch the unassuming companion as she moved with a newfound, unshakable purpose. She reached the piano, turned, and faced the stunned room. "Lord Harrington," she said, her voice clear and carrying, silencing the murmur of conversation. "Before you continue, I believe there is something the Duke of Blackwood would like to share with you all." Harrington froze, his face a mask of fury and confusion. Alistair stared at Eleanor, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning admiration. What was she doing? She looked directly at him, a world of trust and encouragement in her eyes. It was a silent message, a final, crucial bar in their duet. "Don't hide. Don't let him define you. Play." The ballroom was utterly silent. 200 pairs of eyes swiveled from Eleanor to the Duke, then to the furious Lord Harrington, and back again. The air was electric with scandal and anticipation. Harrington, momentarily wrong-footed, saw his carefully laid plan slipping from his grasp. "Miss Vance, this is highly inappropriate," Lord Ashworth began, his brow furrowed in disapproval. But Alistair was no longer looking at Ashworth or Harrington. He was looking only at Eleanor. He saw the unwavering strength in her posture, the absolute faith in her gaze. She was not asking him to retreat or deny. She was challenging him to own his truth, to transform his greatest vulnerability into his greatest strength. In that moment, he understood. Hiding had nearly killed him. It was time to step into the light. With a calm dignity that stunned the onlookers, Alistair inclined his head. "Miss Vance is correct, my lord." He walked away from the stunned investors, his path sure and steady, directly towards the piano. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The Iron Duke, the man who eschewed all frivolity, was approaching a musical instrument with clear intent. He reached the piano and stood beside Eleanor for a brief second. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees. She simply squeezed his hand, a silent transfer of strength. He sat down on the polished stool, and for a moment did nothing but rest his hands on the ivory keys. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, shutting out the whispers and the stares. He was not in a London ballroom. He was back in the dusty music room at Shadowfen, with his audience of one. The only one who mattered. Then he began to play. It was not a sorrowful nocturne or a furious sonata. It was the piece he had composed in the quiet of the northern nights. The melody that began as a hesitant question had blossomed into a confident, soaring theme. It was the sound of winter's end, of snowdrops pushing through frozen earth, of sunlight returning to a forgotten room. The music filled the vast ballroom, silencing every whisper. It was a composition of extraordinary power and emotional depth. It spoke of loss and grief, yes, but it did not dwell there. It moved through the sorrow into a passage of quiet strength, of resilience, of a hard-won peace. And then the melody swelled into its final theme, a breathtaking, triumphant declaration of hope and love. It was the song of a man who was not broken, but whole. A man who had integrated his past with his present and was looking, finally, to the future. The crowd was mesmerized. They had come expecting to witness a man's downfall, to feast on the gossip of his instability. Instead, They were witnessing the baring of a soul and finding not weakness, but a profound and moving strength. They were not seeing the Iron Duke. They were seeing Alistair Beaumont, a man of passion, depth, and immense talent. When the final resonant chord faded into the stillness, the silence held for a beat, thick with awe. Then, Lord Ashworth, a man known for his stern demeanour, began to clap. Slowly at first, then with resounding enthusiasm. The applause spread through the room like a wildfire, a wave of genuine admiration and respect. Harrington stood alone, his face pale, his sneer replaced by a look of utter defeat. He had tried to expose a weakness, but had only succeeded in revealing a strength he could never comprehend. His weapon had been transformed into a crown. Alistair rose from the piano, his eyes finding Eleanor's across the room. The applause, the stares, the whispers, none of it mattered. He walked directly to her, oblivious to the path people cleared for him. He stopped before her, and, in front of the most powerful people in London, he took her hand. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear. "Lord Harrington suggested that my judgment has been clouded of late. On this, he is correct. It has been clouded by years of needless guilt and self-imposed silence. The woman who cleared the fog is standing before you. She taught me that true strength is not the absence of feeling, but the courage to embrace it." He turned to her fully, his grey eyes shining with a love that was as powerful and undeniable as the music he had just played. "Miss Eleanor Vance," he said, dropping to one knee. "You came to my home as a companion, but you became the keeper of my soul. You listened to my heart when it only knew how to speak in sorrow, and you taught it a new song." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple, beautiful diamond ring. "Will you be my Duchess, my wife, my partner in all things? Will you fill my life with music forever?" Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as a joyous, breathless laugh escaped her lips. The world had faded away. There was only this man, her Alistair, who had finally found his voice. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Oh, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger as the ballroom erupted in a fresh, thunderous wave of applause. He rose and pulled her into an embrace, sealing their future with a kiss that was a promise of a lifetime of beautiful music. The Iron Duke was no more. In his place stood a man who had finally learned that the heart is not a fortress to be defended, but an instrument waiting for the right person to play its song. The story of Alistair and Eleanor reminds us that the faces we show the world are often just a mask for the silent battles we fight within. It's a testament to the idea that true healing doesn't come from hiding our scars, but from having the courage to show them to someone who can see the beauty in their story. Their love was born in secrets and silence, built note by note in a dusty, forgotten room, proving that the most profound connections are often made when we dare to listen to the unspoken music of another's heart. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey to Shadowfen Manor. If the story of the Duke and his secret listener touched your heart, please take a moment to show your support. Hitting the like button lets me know you enjoyed it. Sharing it with a fellow romance lover helps our community grow, and subscribing to the channel ensures you won't miss our next tale of love against the odds. Your support means the world. Until next time,